Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our next GoAERO expert lecture. We're so excited to share Tom Judge with you today. As a reminder, please remember to use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar to pose your questions, and we will get through as many as we possibly can. We just want to, again, take the opportunity to welcome you to the GoAERO expert lecture, along with our partners and sponsors. Boeing, NASA, RTX, and several others, as well as our partners all around the world that are supporting us through the course of the next 3 years in the competition. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Judge, our expert lecturer here today. He is the Executive Director of LifeFlight Aviation Services, a nonprofit hospital consortium critical care system serving the hospitals, rural, and island communities throughout Maine. He has an extensive background in emergency medical services and air medicine. Tom has worked in private, public, and non-government sectors, designing and implementing emergency care systems nationally and internationally. Tom has served as air medical and EMS subject matter expert for multiple federal and state committees, including the Institute of Medicine, the Government Accountability Office, the NTSB, the National EMS Advisory Council, and the Department of Transportation. He is particularly interested in patient safety, risk standards development, system design, organizational culture and governance, and the effects of healthcare policy, and in the issues of access and equity in the provision of rural medical care. So thank you, Tom, so much for joining us today, and I hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's both a pleasure and a real honor to participate, and thanks to the whole team at GoAERO and everybody that's on here. So what I'd like to do today is to kind of walk down very quickly give you a sense of a day in the life of emergency medicine and first response, which really sets the context of why we are participating and supporting this initiative. I think the GoAERO, a singular mission to save lives, speaks exactly to what we're talking about. And then, to go fairly quickly through so we have time for questions, what does vertical need, EMS need in the reference to the competition? So there's a test course that everyone's going to compete in, and part of that's been designed by the engineers who want to make sure the vehicles do work as advertised. But part of it's also been informed by EMS experts. So we gathered a bunch of people from around the country, that pilots and EMS professionals, and said, okay, here's the environment that we work in. And so then to kind of move to think of what the EMS needs are in reference to that competition, what the risks that we are to think about, and that the vehicles that, today we have helicopters and we're focused on helicopters today, but, the Helicopter Association International, which has been around for 75 years, this year became the Vertical Association International. So we've got a bunch of LifeFlight helicopters. It's the tools we have today, and hopefully with all of your assistance, we're going to have new tools for tomorrow. But we also sort of brought in, to give you some of the context, some friends of ours, STARS in Western Canada, CareFlight down in New South Wales in Australia, Westpac in Queensland, Australia, Rega in Switzerland, Boston MedFlight, our neighbors here in the Northeast, Norwegian Air Ambulance Foundation, and the London Air Ambulance Trust. So to give you a sense of how all of that works. Then to look at, finally what we're looking for in technology investments to help inform what you're doing. And with that, I sort of go to the first piece of this that for some reason, here we go. So when Igor Sikorsky started vertical flight, so long before anyone knew if anything that works, one of the first things he said is this is going to be a humanitarian mission. And this competition is exactly now, almost 100 years on, the next piece of this evolution of the humanitarian mission. So the EMS context, the world that we live in, we call it a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's our world 24 hours a day. Suddenly things happen. And then there needs to be some sort of response to how we're going to get someone out of a predicament that they're in. And what really drives this is, I think, three things. There's the promise, so that 911 here, there's 119 distinct three-digit numbers all over the world to summon help in a medical emergency. And the promise, I think, is very profound. Great promise in human history. If you call us, we will come. So that's the first part of what we're asking people to do. There's a second part of this. It's the imagination of medicine, the idea of reanimation, to bring life from death. In this case, a 41-year-old nurse in the wilderness of Maine, an entirely team effort, including flight, to get him back to eventually home and life. And then third, this idea of the geography of time, that when you're critically ill with life-taking or potentially life-taking disease, time and geography are just not on your side, which makes the whole idea of vertical flight not tied to roads so important to us. 24/365, it's all unscheduled and it's all time critical. It's very complex medicine, and there's this idea of the geography of time that, as the competitions say, minutes count sometimes. So this is very complex medicine in small spaces, a mini intensive care unit. In this case, here's a patient that is on complete cardiopulmonary bypass. We call it ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxidation. We are breathing for him from the outside with a ventilator. We are using a pump from the outside to have his heart work better, and we're pumping his blood outside of his body to oxygenate it and exchange gases outside of the body and pump it back in. So very, very complex medicine, very tight quarters. In this case, in the middle of January, 20 degrees out, right about to become nighttime. So very complex operations. Or for our smallest, our very miniature, our premature infants who need a mobile ICU that can transition from flight to ground to in the hospital. So complex medicine and time critical medicine. In this case, a woman grievously injured 160 miles from the closest trauma center. And on our arrival, she had about 3 minutes yet to live, right? So 3 minutes more, and she would have had unsurvivable injuries that we could not have compensated for. So time critical becomes a very big part of this and becomes a big part of the competition. So the context needs that we have very differing environments, and part of the way the engineers and then informed by the EMS experts design the competition is to think about these different environments: urban, rural, confined space, vertical, temperature extremes, the surfaces that have to be operated from, the diversity of missions, and all in a very high consequence environment. So here we are in very rural Maine, long distances between people and places. But then we're in the urban center, Boston MedFlight, our colleagues to the south, up on one of the rooftops at Mass General, overlooking the city of Boston. Or in very confined spaces, the London Air Ambulance. If you can imagine an ambulance in the middle of London where ground transport, the ground ambulances, the average with lights and sirens is less than 8 miles an hour of travel. So all of a sudden we come in the most confined spaces to need some sort of vehicle that gives us an alternative to move people and equipment in a timely manner. Or in vertical rescue of trying to extract people from doing things, that have gotten in predicaments. And then where is that surface we're going to get them, exit them from where they are to do things. But then also the vertical rescue with hoists. In this case, our colleagues at Intermountain LifeFlight in Salt Lake City. And today, one of the challenges we have is that the rotor blades on a helicopter obviously prevent anything from being a vertical extraction right from the face of the vertical which when we think of our urban environments becomes a very critical piece to us of what new technologies might be able to give us in skyscrapers. Extremes of temperature that we work, again, 24/365. It doesn't really, the weather affects us, but where those are extremes of temperature, they may be very cold and a few months later, it may be boiling hot in the hot haze of summer. The surfaces that we land on, whether it's frozen, or it's under, to think about those surfaces, and part of the competition relies around what are these surfaces you're going back and forth from that are going to be important, which might be a frozen lake, but it also might be a beach. In this case, our colleagues in Westpac in Australia. Or it might be the mountains and the valleys of the mountains. In this case, our colleagues at STARS in Western Canada, through the valleys. How do we, again, when we have an unpredicted medical emergency, whether it's trauma or disease, how do we get to that person quickly? How do we bring the life-saving technology to them, and how do we extract them and transport them to the care that they need? Or that may be surf rescue. So all of these different kinds of pieces, and the very differing in multiple missions in vertical flight. Forest firefighting, and oftentimes changing the attributes and the configuration of a vertical flight to meet the different needs of missions. Or in the case of Katrina, where over 30,000 people got flown in a very short period of time, because all of a sudden the entire environment becomes unworkable from the standpoint of using a ground ambulance. And finally, safety, that this is a very high consequence environment. And so designing this, and again, from the engineer's standpoint, and putting any new aircraft into operation, really the safety of that becomes, the safety of the operation becomes imperative. That this is, often feels like a blur, but it's a very highly visible impact of medicine. Often in the media, it's always has very high emotional content in decision making, and how we interface with deciding to go, no go, all of those. And when there's a failure, it's very highly visible. So safety becomes a linchpin to all of this. And that takes us to the next piece of what are the vertical flight operation risks that we really need to think about. And again, the competition begins to design around those, so that no one knows exactly where, what the weather's going to be when the competition takes place. So you really have to think about all of these pieces as you're putting your submissions together of what that technology will look like. So confined space, again, in this case, vertical obstructions, wires become a very big challenge, and some of the design competition is really around those kinds of confined spaces, but also can be winds and again, obviously other sorts of vertical obstructions that need to be dealt with. Or it could be hot and high, that the density, altitude, the temperature, humidity affect everything in aviation and lift. And so designing, thinking about those things, this is again, our colleagues down in New South Wales and up in the Northern Territories. Visibility and icing, that it's not just the extremes of weather, but icing becomes a very, very big challenge for us, and the ability to accrete ice, that the temperature goes down as the elevation goes up, and what can be rain on the ground at 1,000 feet can be accrete ice, and that becomes a very, very big challenge for us. Obviously, operating at night becomes a very big risk to us. Probably 40% or more of what we do at LifeFlight is at night, and that's brings in a whole nother set of risks of how do we have to manage those, and then with visibility. that this is instrument flight, that precision flight becomes a really important piece of the risks that we take on. So when we think about this and think about the technologies and the investment, and as you're working on designing pieces, the reliability, the adaptability, the ability to work with precision flight, and lots of the competition is designed around that precision. Obviously, the safety technologies to be able to safely go from one place, point A, to point B, and back to point A or back to point C, how we're going to do that. That in everything that we look at, and then when we make investments, that every aircraft has a space, a weight, and an energy penalty. And so the engineers build us aircraft, and then we end up trying to put more and more medical technology that takes energy, that takes weight, that takes electricity, that affects performance. And the most classic example of this, and sort of the vertical flight of where this goes awry, you remember, now 12 or 14 years ago, the presidential helicopters in the United States are actually pretty old helicopters. And they had finally agreed that they were going to design and build a new big competition, between all the major aviation companies for a helicopter. They decide on a helicopter, and then the Navy got a hold of it and said, well, but we want to put all these other things in the helicopter. And by the time they were done, the helicopter couldn't perform the mission. So thinking about what goes on inside the aircraft and the design that you're doing is going to become important. They've got sort of the baselines of that, but the power to weight ratios all become. The endurance for us is critical, especially in a rural environment. The endurance of flight is one of the tests. And then the operating costs and the capital cost. And that's really not in the competition, but as all of you think forward of where the next step, that if you have designed something that can really become that new tool in the emergency, medicine and emergency first response community, we also need to make that operational. And so reliability and adaptability, this is, our colleagues, again, very high, clear, cold in the mountains of Switzerland with Rega, again, looking at landing on different surfaces. To think about the precision piece, the FAA 2016 and 17 published their performance-based navigation of the National Airspace Strategic Plan, and how vertical flight fits into that precision. In this case, this is the first precision route, PBN 0.3 route, required navigation performance 0.3, goes from Bangor, Maine to Bar Harbor, Maine. This is the first route in the country, but all this work gets done, and so the precision was part of the design of the competition. And then when you can't see where you're going, so again, here up above the clouds, and instrument flight for us becomes really important. And then the operating at night, the safety technologies that we put in, that all of our people are operating with military night vision when it comes to night. So all of that range of precision technology and the safety technology layered over that become really important. And then, the idea of endurance and putting, and where we go, this is our colleagues in the Norwegian Air Ambulance Foundation, really doing some very innovative work. They're working at putting a CAT scanner in a helicopter, saying that if we're serious about stroke care in a rural environment, we need to bring the technology that can determine what's going on to the actual point of need. So thinking about all of those pieces. And finally, then, what is the capital cost? And to us, the operating cost is actually more important than the capital cost. Just as a little editorial, this is the little town that I live in Maine, a helicopter going over Port Clyde, Maine, our helicopters. But those become to us that everybody wants something bigger, everyone wants something that's shinier, but the performance of the aircraft and the operating costs of that become really critical. So that's a lot in a little bit of time. The good part is that they've recorded this, and obviously, as with all of the supporting people, the experts, as it were, we're available to the teams to answer questions and help inform as this goes on forward. But back in 2006, when we did this, the Institute of Medicine did a major rethink of what the emergency care system looked like in the United States. And there was one part of hospitals, one part of children, one part of EMS. And this is the epigraphic that in the end, you know, when we're faced with the humanitarian need, as Igor put it at the very start of vertical flight, knowing's not enough. We have to figure out how to do things, and willing's not enough. We have to roll up our sleeves. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I know that was a lot in a fairly short period of time, and happy to go back to any point that someone was like, give me a little bit more information on that point.
Tom, thank you so much. We've got some questions rolling in. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to post your questions. Why don't we start with something a little broad, and you can speak to this in as much detail as you feel appropriate here, but what advantages do you sort of see with VTOL versus helicopters? Is there an advantage, and what does that sort of look like?
So there's lots of work going on in the space, and if you think of a place like London, the idea of rotors, and the London Air Ambulance has no tail rotor, which is obviously one of the biggest risks of operation. But the VTOLs in a confined space, I think in an urban environment, we're going to see a lot of use for those. And as I said, in vertical rescue, if there aren't, you know, a main rotor diameters that extend beyond the envelope of the vehicle, then it becomes a whole new opportunity to say, how could I take someone out of a high rise? You know, that there's no fire department ladder long enough to get up to the top of high rises today. So how could I maybe think about doing those? So we think that VTOL, especially in an urban environment, is going to be important. We're certainly looking at it as different energy needs. As we think about our carbon footprints and what we do. I buy hundreds of thousands of gallons of jet fuel a year. I'm thinking about all of those pieces going forward. I think that part of the challenge for VTOL is going to be endurance, and that in a rural environment, and then obviously, you know, there's our people working on this, but thinking about what happens to icing. So icing in a light, a smaller aircraft that weighs less than 20,000 pounds gross weight, de-icing is near impossible today. So thinking about materials, technologies, how that might change is going to be important in the VTOL world. So excited to look at those. And then there's going to be smaller, so that part of competition is that in our case, we have to move a patient. We have to care for a patient and move a patient. But there's also lots of needs of whether it's delivering a defibrillator, whether it's delivering medical supplies. One of the pieces that we have that's a medical need is we have, you know, islands with population, and we need to get labs results to the laboratories on the mainlands and back to the islands. We do that on a ferry today. That might be a very different system with VTOL in the future. And then getting people to the scene of an emergency quickly is, I think, another big piece that people should be thinking about.
So we have several questions as it relates to sort of perhaps equipment and the equipment that you might have on board. If there was one piece of medical equipment you want with you, what would it be?
I would like to get it down to one piece of medical equipment, and obviously that's a stethoscope, but and the hands of a caregiver. That's the two most important pieces of medical equipment that we have. But beyond that, that we're going to need oxygen. We're going to need some way to restart a heart. Um, Obviously, we layer in and we measure all of our medical equipment to the ounce. I mean, literally measuring things to the ounce. And when we buy medical technology to put in the aircraft, we have to think about how do we attach it? What's the weight? What's the space penalty? What's the energy penalty? How do we support that as we go forward? So uh, the monitoring, the patient monitoring systems, and the military is working on new versions of these that have become lighter weight all the time, but that's going to become probably the single most important, probably piece of diagnostics and continuing, be able to continually monitor someone's homeostasis status.
So, Tom, if you were to sort of think about the smallest package of critical gear a first responder needs, what's the sort of size, as you sort of just mentioned, in terms of measuring even down to sort of ounces, and what's the sort of weight you're looking at, sort of the smallest package of gear that a responder should think about?
I would think that would probably be in the vicinity of 25 to 50 kilograms
Mm.
of pieces of equipment. We look at a medical interior, which involves more than just the medical equipment. And in our to the interior, the medical compartment of an aircraft, we have that down, including all of our equipment, to about 245 kilograms. Sometimes we have to put more things like putting an ECMO, putting pumps and those kinds of pieces in becomes a big challenge. Um, but I think the individual piece of what someone can carry, that you're probably in the 25 to maybe 50 kilograms, because that's what someone can carry once they're on the ground. And then obviously more equipment. Not really part of the competition. I think my at least understanding of the competition is to get a vehicle that can do the flight testing as a first step. But
Mhm.
it's important for everyone to think about what this all means going forward.
Mhm. Mhm. Uh, how would EMS, emergency response, approach autonomous and remotely piloted vehicles for rescue, in
I,
your view?
I think that's going to become a very, very important piece. The regulatory community obviously is not quite there yet, but it's coming. It's coming in the civilian commercial world. It is already in place in the military world. Um, but an autonomous vehicle, if we think of one of our risks that we face, is that we have, in our case, a single pilot in an aircraft. Now, they have a very advanced autopilot. That autopilot can bring an aircraft to within 10 feet of the ground, right? So we can go to a precise point within 10 feet of the ground with the autopilots. But if something happened to a pilot, being able to get that aircraft safely back on the ground. And when we think of a fairly compact vehicle, the idea of autonomous flight, that my pilot, who we really rely on, and we've got some great pilots, they all weigh, 200 pounds, right? 200, 225 pounds. So that's becomes, if we can make this autonomous, we can potentially take that 225 pounds and turn it into useful weight. So again, thinking forward, that there may be today and there may be incremental steps in autonomous flight, all are going to become critically important to us. And obviously, as we get to precision flight, you know, the pilots are managing technology. They're getting the aircraft off the ground and on the ground. But once the aircraft's off the ground, we have 4-axis autopilots that are very, very precise, that can fly very specific routes. And we'll get that down to, a box that's a few hundred feet wide and a few hundred feet high that's going to be absolutely precise to be in that box at any given moment. And our colleagues in Switzerland and Riga are working, along those lines, quickly now.
Tom, can you share more about the percentage of HEMS missions that involve an evacuation? And then share a little bit more about how the single occupant aircraft that GoAERO is asking teams to build can fulfill the medevac missions that you perform.
Sure. So medical helicopters are worldwide at this point. It's, probably the developed world just because of finance. It's had more, but if you look at Eastern Europe, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of disruption in the social fabric of countries. And so go to the Czech Republic as an example, and they quickly made a decision that in the future, they weren't going to be able to afford bricks and mortar medicine in all of their little communities. We're in the same boat in Maine. So the helicopter, for those patients, selected group of patients who are very sick, need a major hospital right next to them, wherever they are, the helicopter, in our case, the helicopter, but say the vertical flight vehicle, becomes that opportunity to provide equity and access to care as if someone lived down the street from a major medical center. And so that's important worldwide. And we're seeing that people are beginning to understand the economics of that differently, especially as we have a staffing crisis in doctors and nurses worldwide. We have a staffing crisis in doctors and nurses and the associated health professionals, especially in rural areas. So that becomes the idea of leveraging technology to expand the workforce. Today, there's about 400,000 EMS flights with a patient on board in the United States every year. We expect that number, especially because of rural changes, and as we reconfigure the healthcare system, we expect that number to go up. So the need will go up. And I'll give you a classic example that, when I trained in medicine many, many years ago, as you can tell from my white hair, that if someone had a stroke, we basically gently took care of them, maybe gave them a little oxygen, and 3 days later, their doctor would tell them what the rest of their life would look like. Now, if we can get to that patient, our colleagues in Norway, and identify if they're having an embolic, a blockage to a vessel, or a hemorrhagic, a bleed, treatment's obviously totally different at the point of need, and we can intervene in that very, very quickly. Less than 3 hours from onset, that person can walk out of the hospital, no damage, go back to completely normal life. Stroke is the leading cause of disability in the entire world. If we could change that, that's a big economic. So the kinds of things that this competition is doing to say, can we open up access to care? Can we open up the equity of care, especially in rural populations, through new technology is incredibly important to medicine.
Tom, how do you consider in rescues downdrafts from propulsion of factors of wind chill?
Say that again.
I think the question might need a bit of clarification. If the person that posted this question wouldn't mind clarifying a little bit here, but do rescues consider downdrafts from propulsion as factors of wind chill?
Not as factors of wind chill, although, well, let me put that. So I showed one of the pictures of a helicopter next to a snowmobile sled with a patient on it, grievously injured. We obviously didn't land next to that patient because the downdraft from from our helicopter is about 75, 80 miles an hour of wind. And in an icy environment, you're blowing all that snow and ice around. So that would be potential for wind chill. Larger helicopters, there's actually a study in Australia that the Civil Aviation Authority there put together that looked at as they've moved to larger civilian helicopters, they have had problems with downdraft, injuring people and causing damage. And so we do need to think about downdraft and precisions of those, because that can create a whiteout, it can create a brownout, and it can blow people over. I mean, even we have a couple hospital helipads that are right sort of in the middle of parking lots outside the emergency departments, the hospitals, and even in our pretty small helicopter, 7,000-pound gross weight, we blew a lady over that was close to the helipad. So downdraft is a consideration. It's a huge safety consideration. Wind chill is not really the part of it except in the wintertime, but the power of the downdraft is something to be considered.
We have a rather specific question. Do you know the estimated weight of a CAT scan machine and how much electrical power it might need to run?
Yeah, right. So our colleagues in Norway have got this down to about 170 kilograms. A CT scanner is a big machine. It's a really big magnet. And so they're able to power it with what they have in the helicopter. That's the design. Probably won't be a helicopter larger than ours to get that into. We're beginning to see CAT scanners in ambulances. The Australians are working on 3 different research projects. One is a CAT scanner in an aircraft. One is sort of a scanner that looks like a football helmet. One's a little ring scanner, obviously much smaller, much less weight, much less electricity to do those. It's interesting that after Katrina, I was the president of the Association of Aeromedical Services here, and what was then the American Helicopter Society and is now the Vertical Flight Society, which is really the association of all the engineers. Montreal is one of the big, it's the Silicon Valley of vertical flight. And they asked me to up there to speak about helicopters at Katrina, and I got to the end and said, here's my dilemma. And I think this is one of these real dilemmas that we need to solve in medicine. I have a road worker, the flaggers on roads, one of the most dangerous occupations there is, right? So he's out in Edmonds, Maine, and he gets clocked by the mirror of a truck going by. So now he's on the road, he's unconscious. We don't know if he has a brain injury or if he has a simple concussion or if he's just seeing stars for a few minutes and he's going to be fine. In Edmonds, Maine, he could go 25 miles in one direction, 30 miles to a little critical access hospital. They do have radiology, may not have a CAT scanner, certainly have no neurosurgeon, certainly don't have someone that could read that CAT scan if they could get it. Go 35 miles in the other direction, pretty much the same, slightly larger hospital, imaging, but no neurosurgeon. Or I can send a helicopter 100 miles and pick him up and fly him back to a trauma center. Now, if we get him back to the trauma center and he didn't have a brain injury, we've just spent a lot of healthcare resources for no benefit. But if he did have a brain injury, he ends up in this little hospital and that not prepared to take care of him, then all of a sudden his chances of a good outcome go down by the minute. So this is the uncertainty in emergency medicine is one of the pieces. And what I think is one of the brilliant parts of this competition is to think of how we can leverage technology to get care to the point of need. And if we can do that more precisely, we can do that more quickly, we can do that in more spaces than we can do it today because we have a vehicle that has different attributes, doesn't have big main rotors, can land things and land in spaces that we might not be able to do. I think those are really important parts of medicine and that where technology can really help people, especially across the rural and developing world. That's going to be, we know that a helicopter, by research that in Western Massachusetts, a helicopter staffed with as an ICU with an ICU level team is the equivalent to the geographic time equivalent of 6 to 7 ambulances in Western Massachusetts. In South Africa, the Western Cape, that same helicopter is worth 50 ground ambulances from the standpoint of time to care. And so, these new technologies can really begin to think about worldwide, how do we get care to people? How do we extract them? How do we deliver diagnostics and interventions at the point of need? But then also, how do we do these other pieces of water rescue and vertical rescue and firefighting and all of these other needs in the rural landscape to become critically important?
Tom, there's a question here for that I will take an opportunity to answer. But in the meantime, if you can consider sort of as teams think about how they're developing their aircraft, and as they're sort of considering the 3 missions that they need to accomplish, are there some resources that you might be able to highlight that they should sort of look at, review, consider as they're developing their aircraft, given the lens of emergency response? The question that we have here is about how we are taking into consideration sort of, let's say, torrential rain, thunderstorms, et cetera, that might be experienced in the equatorial region, in rainforests and things like this. So as a response to that, we'd like to say that, the missions themselves are sort of somewhat of a simulation of the different types of emergency crises, disasters, situations that have been described to us from various first responders and emergency care people from around the world. And so we have tried to develop missions that speak to as many situations as we possibly can, knowing, of course, that we cannot speak to anything and everything that exists in the world. However, you will note in the adversity mission, we are speaking to different environments, different terrains, like hill, like sand, like flooding and rain and wind. So we hope that in some ways we are addressing these conditions that you are speaking of. And we hope that you can only continue to sort of consider those situations post-competition.
Yeah, and I would add to that, because I think that this is designing something. And one of my great friends was a professor at the Harvard Business School, and he said, what really made me successful in life is I was 70% correct.
Mm-hmm.
Look at some of this, like, you're 70% correct. That doesn't sound that great. And he said, if you're 70% correct and you go to Las Vegas, you're good. You're good. And so I think that as you said, that probably there's going to be a piece of this that further adaptation for a specific environment of the technology, but designing something that will do the most for the most people, and without, one of the things in medicine we always say is that when you hear the thunder of hoofs, it's probably horses, not zebras. So I think you've done a great job of describing that. Well, the engineers and the EMS designed the tests, the various tests to go through as the competition, is to get the sort of the basic thing that we know could work in most environments.
Mm-hmm.
Now that said, that same helicopter that is hot and high in the desert in Australia is the same helicopter that operates at the North Pole, and it operates, in Darwin, which is the equator. So the vehicles can, with adaptation. I think the icing, the very cold, the very high temperatures are a challenge, and the temperature extremes have become more of a challenge as the avionics and the computers in an aircraft. Our little helicopters probably have 60 to 70 different computers of different running engines, running sort of everything. Everything from the weather radars to the autopilots to the engine controls to all of those pieces is lots of little computers. The extremes of temperature are hard on those. I think that as people thinking about technology going forward, making those pieces of technology more robust for temperature is, I think, going to be important. But if we can get something that can get, to 90%, and then how does that technology get adapted? I think the question is, the equator is a very different environment than we operate in, and is a very different environment that if we went up into the northern extremes of Canada, or Europe. The same helicopters today, they're in Norway, they're in Greece, they're in Africa. Let's get it mostly right as a first step, and then think of how we continue to refine it.
Thank you. Would low-cost specialized flights be useful and mitigate need for more complex flight systems that approach a full ICU?
Can you ask that again?
Sure. Would low-cost specialized flights be useful and mitigate need for more complex flight systems that approach a full ICU?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So let me think of it this way. So that while there's 400,000 EMS flights a year in the United States, and basically because of the various things of insurance regulations and all those are the really sickest patients. There's 22 million 911 calls a year in the United States every year. 22 million patients. There's lots of those patients that, especially in rural America, don't really need an ICU. They don't need that helicopter that's coming with an ICU, but they do need someone to take care of someone, to take care of the patient, to bring some basic technology to the point of need. So again, that if we think of a rural space with a ground ambulance and staffing a ground ambulance, if we could extend the geographical coverage within the same amount of time by using flight technology, vertical flight technology, we've done something really good for that community. So the answer is yes. So on one hand, we're an ICU, but that just extraction and basic care, that we're having to struggle staffing our ambulances. So, back to your question on autonomy, that one of the things that, even in the ground ambulance side, we're like, what if we didn't have to have a driver? That would give us another caregiver. So all of those little pieces become important. So yes, basic care, getting people to get basic care is a very, very important part of rural life. We know that in life-taking disease and trauma, that every single minute that's not getting intervened, the chances of good outcomes go down, literally minute by minute by minute. And so I think there's some real opportunities to think about this at the basic level, the advanced level, and the tertiary ICU level. Still there, Needy?
Oh, apologies, I went on mute. Tom, what are the minimum interior space and head height requirements for safe medical transport?
A great question. I think that generally in aircraft now you're looking at about 4.5 feet. I'd have to convert that to centimeters as sort of vertical. If you think of aircraft, when you're designing aircraft, today, regardless of what kind of aircraft, and engineers working on aircraft. They design it for the 90th percentile person who is 6'2" in height and 212 pounds in weight. Or roughly 100, a little bit less than 100 kilograms. And so that becomes what a patient looks like. Most of our aircraft, probably 4.5 feet so that we could get over top of a patient. But not, they are small. I think there is a piece of this that's important in the design, and I think they'll probably be, anticipating that there'll be different vehicles in the design. You have to move Stan, or I think that's the name of the patient in the vehicle. But if you think about it, if anyone's ever been in an MRI, it's a very narrow little tube, and people get claustrophobic. And so I think that there is a piece of space around a patient which becomes important. Happy to give a little bit more, sort of a little more research and send you some answers on kind of what we think those spaces are. But as you can see the pictures from our aircraft, people sitting down. If we have crew members that are 6'2" or above, their heads leaning over when they're sitting down, and they eventually complain about their necks. All of, it's small, but certainly willing to answer more depth.
Tom, are there any helicopter pilots also qualified as medical first responders?
There are, but we generally, as a rule, keep the disciplines distinct. And the reason that we keep the discipline distinct is that we want to make sure the pilots are solely focused. And that's going to be whether it's a human hands-on pilot, or it's when we think of the automation in this and autonomous flight, there still is someone somewhere that's operating that vehicle, and we want their full attention to be the safety of flight. So as a rule, we don't, do pilots help carry things, help move stuff, and certainly there's plenty of pilots, and I've had medical crew that decide they want to become a pilot, and they become a different discipline. So, and certainly in the military, I think you'd find that, but generally we keep the disciplines very integrated but distinct.
That's a really great point. I wonder if we can revisit the question of resources, perhaps, if you have any resources that our team should consider that they should utilize, or is there any sort of go-to website that they might consider reviewing as they're developing their aircraft, particularly with the lens of emergency care and response?
I think that's I think it's a difficult question, because one of the things that we would not want people to do is answer tomorrow's problems with today's solutions. And so I think that we want to be careful to not, that you can easily see how you can get bias into the design because you're reflecting around how it gets done today. I think that there's no question that if you went to any of the the helicopter manufacturers today, and it's leaving aside propulsion, leaving aside how the aircraft, what the wings are, which are the rotors, how the directional, the tail rotors, leaving all, just take all of that and just discount all of that, and just look at the interiors of spaces that any one of the major helicopter manufacturers, you can get a sense of what that and whether it's Bell or Airbus or Leonardo or Sikorsky, you could get a sense of what those interiors look like and what the interiors look like from a medical support. But I think, going back to the earlier question, that that part of this might not be the ICU in the sky. It may be a much more basic vehicle. So people might want to look at the interior of an ambulance, or you might want to go down to your local fire or EMS station and knock on the door and ask people about their jobs, ask people, what works and doesn't work, take a look at their ambulance, just so you get the inside. I think what I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to do is to look at the vehicles to today and have that, what the design competition becomes is refining the vehicle of today. I think what we would certainly hope to see going forward is new technologies for tomorrow, that completely new, might be, the proverbial out of the box, but the innovation becomes really important to us. And certainly, I think we're here, we volunteered to be experts for the competition. So if someone has a specific question, I think and one of the slides that's on there has my email. Email is always the easiest way to get to me. And obviously the GoAERO team is fielding questions all the time, and will assist anybody with those things of, like, if we want some little specifics about this.
And on that note, thank you so much for that really, really important point that you noted. We are at time now. Thank you so much for your incredible knowledge and expertise that you bring to the competition and to our teams. We really appreciate you taking the time for this lecture. Folks on the line, as you remember, please utilize herox.com/GoAERO and use the forum to post any additional questions that you might have. You can also email us at info@goaeroprize.com. Please be sure to stay tuned. We have many lectures coming up in the next few weeks, and we look forward to your participation. As always, a recording will be posted in the coming days, also on the website. Tom, thank you again.
Yeah. And thank you. And obviously, I don't, we just see there's a number of the participants. And really thank you to all of you that are participating in this. The GoAERO team is great, and they've come up with something innovation. But for us, as a caregiver, as someone that's out on the front line of trying to take care of patients and figuring out ways to do better, I'd really like to thank everyone that's engaging in this competition, because you will save lives. You will make a difference in the world, and that's incredibly important to us on the front line.
Tom, thank you so much once again, and yeah, we look forward to staying engaged with you over the next 3 years. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.